right? Until then, generally you could write history with just the politics and the people they didn't have to be present really at all. Okay, now the weakness of this, or a tendency within this, is that it will tend to move you towards an ethnic understanding of what the nation is, right? Because if where you're identifying the nation is in its customs and its language and so on, well, what if there are other people? I've already mentioned the Greeks and the Jews. There are probably others in Ukraine. We'll get to them. But what if there are other people who don't speak the same language or who have markedly different customs? What do you do with them, right? That's the problem of ethnicity. That if you define the nation in terms of customs, then that always is going to raise the question of what about the other people? Okay, and then here comes the interesting part. It's not that nobody noticed this at the time. The people who came up with the ethnic notion of the nation, this is a little logical point here, but ethnicity didn't exist, right? It was being created. So the people who came up with the ethnic notion of the nation were not ethnic themselves. They couldn't have been, because the idea was just kind of coming into being. And even if you don't buy that, and you believe, okay, there was a thing called ethnicity at the time, they were very often themselves coming from what we would think of as a minority position, right? So Kureichik, as the Ukrainian historians might not tell you, had a Polish mom. And that is very typical, right? Very typical. If you look at the people who invented the populism, the social history, and sometimes later the ethnic nationalism all across Eastern Europe, it is very often people who were from a Jewish minority or a German minority or some kind of minority who themselves adopt the ethnic position or create the ethnic position, right? And so I say that not because it's like a clever paradox, but I say that to alert you to the fact that the very thing which is supposed to be the most eternal and unchanging is not, right? It was the thing the very notion of the eternity and the unchangingness is created by people who are very often changing themselves in some way. Not that they dropped all the sophistication that came from the background that they had, right? Being multicultural and multilingual certainly helps you as a historian to write history books. But they're keeping that, and they're saying history is really about the people who are in this one language. Okay, so that leads us to a debate. Right? That's a position, that's a debate. And on the other side of this debate is a character. Okay, I really should have made a sheet for today, I guess. Is a character called Vyacheslav Lipinski. And Lipinski says, basically, hey, Kureichik, look at Ukraine. The cities are full of Russian speakers, lots of Jews, lots of Polish nobles. How are you going to make your state out of that? You're not just going to be able to say the Ukrainian people, the masses of the peasants. You need this very commonsensical point. We need the cities, and we need the taxpayers, and those traditional historical. Going back to these traditional stories, the people who are from the traditional stories. What are we going to do with them? Are we just going to eliminate them, or maybe we should give them a different role, right? So Lipinski answers Kureichik by saying, fine, the people are coming into politics, but if we're going to have a nation, the nation is going to have to be politically savvy enough to say, okay, there's a place for the Polish nobility. Maybe they don't get to own the land anymore, but they get something, right? There has to be a place for the Jews. There has to be a place for the people who used to own the land. We can't just imagine them away, right? We can say, it's beautiful to say that the essence of the nation is in the countryside and the people who till the soil and look at the sunset and the beautiful mounds of hay, right? You've seen the art that arises from all this, right? Look at that beautiful image, there's a beautiful woman and there's her beautiful daughter, and look, they have a scythe, and that's the nation, right? It's beautiful, it's very persuasive. But what are you going to do about the people who live in the cities? What are you going to do about what do you do about all those other people? And how are you can't have a nation without the cities. Right? So what do you do? So Lipinski has an answer to this, right? Lipinski has an answer. Lipinski in his turn, and don't worry, we're going to do all this history many, many times over. Lipinski in turn, did I mention he was from a Polish noble family? He was from a Polish noble family. Okay. Lipinski in turn is answered by a guy called Dontsov. Dontsov, now we're getting into the 1920s and 1930s, and Dontsov is the most important ideologist of Ukrainian far right-wing politics. In fact, fascism. And Dontsov says, Dontsov is he's very much inspired by the Italians, right? Dontsov says, no, it is really all about the people, and the people really should be homogenous, right? And the people really should rebel against all these other traditions. Okay. Dontsov, I'm gonna let you guess. Okay, I won't let you guess. He had a brother who was a Bolshevik, and that Bolshevik brother was a Russian, right? So like it's an example of how the people who are maybe even the most radical on the ethnic side of things, they're not coming from the ethnicity. They're choosing something. At the beginning, you have to choose, because at the beginning the nation is still coming into being. So you have to choose, right? Okay, so Dontsov is answering Lipinski. These guys are enemies, and the Dontsov tradition of what we call ethnic nationalism is important. It matters in Ukrainian political life, and it matters in Ukrainian diaspora. It continues in North America. But Dontsov, in turn, was answered by this guy that we're supposed to be reading. Now, I'm aware that his book turns out not to be in the bookstore. I put the first essay up online, and we will keep putting the essays up online. And we're reading Ivan Rudnitsky because he is a foundational political historian of Ukraine, and he lays out some of the major issues. But in context, right? In context, Ivan Rudnitsky is trying to handle this argument which says that the Ukrainian nation is only about people who speak Ukrainian, and that there's somewhere out there, at least aspirationally, there's a homogenous Ukrainian nation, right? Ivan Rudnitsky is trying to handle that. What he's arguing, and you should now, as you read him, I want you to read him to learn about Ukrainian history, obviously. He's good at setting up the major questions, but he's also coming into this debate about what the nation actually is supposed to be. And Ivan Rudnitsky takes the position that the nation is fundamentally a political act. It's fundamentally about political commitment. So modernization matters. Sure. The traditional landowning classes, they matter, sure. The presence of the Jews matters. This all matters, but the nation is fundamentally a political act directed towards the future. That doesn't mean it's voluntarist and you can do anything. You can't make it up, right? You can only act on the basis of what really is, and he mostly wrote about the past. But the nation itself is a political act directed towards the future, which means that in principle, anyone can take part in it, right? Anyone can take part. Okay, so I'm now just going to say one word about who Ivan Rudnitsky was. Very important. He wins. Okay, he wins the argument, which is kind of fascinating. If there's any person who wins the argument, I mean, maybe in the 22nd century it'll look different, but looking at it from the point of 2022, he wins the argument in North America, and he also wins the argument in Ukraine. Although as we'll see, there are many reasons in Ukraine why his arguments are going to seem plausible. But he wins the argument about what Ukraine should be like, and that in turn has very important implications for what Ukraine is like, right? Because theorizing the nation is not an abstract action. It's also about how you form the nation, right? Okay, so 30 seconds and I'll tell you who Ivan Rudnitsky is and we'll return to that. So Ivan Rudnitsky was halakhically Jewish. His grandmother was born Ida Spiegel. In the Habsburg monarchy, she married a Ukrainian, and they had 5 children. After he died early, the husband, and Ida Spiegel, who was alienated from her family and took the name Olga, raised the children to be Ukrainian. The common language in the family was, anybody want to take a shot at that? Common language. Russian. We're in the Habsburg monarchy. Not bad. or in Galicia in the Habsburg monarchy? Polish. Common language between, I mean, her mother tongue was Yiddish, and his mother tongue was Ukrainian, although he had Polish grandparents. But their language between themselves was Polish. The kids' best language for a long time was also Polish, right? So there were five kids with this Jewish mother. All five of them became very important figures in the Ukrainian national movement. We'll talk about that. But there was one daughter, Milena. Milena was a feminist and a very prominent parliamentarian in the Polish parliament. She did some extraordinary things that we'll talk about later on. But Milena Rudnicka was the mother of Ivan Rudnicki, right? So so his mother's mother was self-identifying Jewish, which is so everybody who's taking part in these conversations, regardless of their position, is coming from all over the place. But there's a conversation where Rudnicki ends up being the most influential figure, and that conversation shapes not only this class, it very much shapes the way that Ukrainians are talking about nationality now. Okay, I'll leave you with that,